All right. So welcome back, everybody. I think we'll get started again. So we're about to move to the session where our independent expert panel will do some question and answer and comments on the presentation by Donna Logan. I'm going to introduce the science panel members to you. But before I do that, a few housekeeping details. Again, first cell phone that goes off, person runs down to Pilates and buys lattes for the entire science panel. For the consultants and the independent science panel members, a large part of the purpose of these reviews is to kind of translate the studies that have been done into terms that a general audience that's unschooled in these sort of socioeconomic things, such as your poor moderator, might be able to understand. So if you could do your best to avoid jargon, or if it's unavoidable, to try to explain it. And then finally, there's a lot of, we're televising this, and there's a lot of people on the internet. And if you're not close to your microphone, they have a hard time hearing. So I'd like to ask everybody when you're making comments to pull your microphone up close to you. So Todd pointed out that this panel is full of people that basically are based in Alaska, with the minor exception of Don Calloway, who spent, I think he told me, 27 years here and spends a lot of time here still. So in terms of this sort of expertise, having a panel that's based in Alaska is pretty important, and we're fortunate to get this group of people. And I guess I'd like to start off by introducing the panel members. I'll start with Dr. Don Calloway, retired from the National Park Service. Don, if you could raise your hand. Don Calloway, a senior cultural anthropologist, retired from the National Park Service after 27 years of employment in the Alaska region. Dr. Calloway's research focuses on subsistence issues, climate change, and the social and cultural impacts of regulatory mining and energy initiatives. Based on training and practical experience, he employs a variety of methodologies in his research, including ethnographic case studies, survey research, and multivariate statistical analysis, which I appreciate, oral history, formal social network analysis as well. Don has conducted extensive field work in over 50 Alaska rural indigenous communities and nearly a dozen indigenous communities in the Russian Far East. He was an adjunct faculty member at the University of Alaska Anchorage, kind of a common theme of our panel members. Taught classes at that institution for almost 2 decades, and he currently lives in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. He got his PhD in anthropology from the University of Michigan, and he was a postdoctoral fellow in statistics at the University of California, Berkeley. Our next panel member, Dr. Steve Colt, with the University of Alaska Institute of Social and Economic Research, and I wanted to take this opportunity to give an independent review of ICER. They're one of my favorite organizations. If you go to their website and sign up to get on their mailing list every month or so, you get this wonderful economic study of public policy in Alaska, anything from rural economies to gas pipeline economics to the economics of native corporations, and of course fisheries economics, which I'm particularly interested in. So I'd like to encourage you all to do that. Steve Colt is a professor of economics at the University of Alaska Anchorage at that Institute of Social and Economic Research. He began working at ICER in 1984 as a research associate and has about 20 years of research experience in Alaska. Dr. Colt's principal research interests include energy economics with emphasis on renewables, isolated utility systems in the demand side, and the economics of ecosystem services, including tourism and recreation. He's also studied Alaska Native corporations, His research is typically cross-disciplinary and problem-oriented. For example, working with an electrical engineer on concept plans for integrated village energy storage systems that might displace diesel, or working with natural scientists and GIS experts to develop and integrate information on economic use values with biophysical data using a common geography. He earned a BA in economics with a concentration in environmental studies from Williams College and a PhD in economics from MIT. Next on our panel is Dr. Josh Greenberg, who has just hurriedly arrived from Fairbanks about an hour ago. He's with the University of Alaska Fairbanks. He's somebody whose publications on fisheries economics I'm quite familiar with. He's an associate professor of resource economics at the University of Alaska Fairbanks and associate professor of economics in the School of Management. Dr. Greenberg's research includes bioeconomic modeling, economic issues pertaining to the allocation of Alaska's renewable natural resources, and the economics of Alaska's reindeer industry. He's got a Master of Science in Resource Economics from the University of Alaska Fairbanks and a doctorate in agricultural economics from Washington State University. Next, Dr. Sharman Haley, also with the University of Alaska. She's been researching social science and public policy issues, also at the Institute of Social and Economic Research since 1994. She retired from full-time employment in 2011, but continues to work part-time as an adjunct professor. Prior to that, she worked in Juneau as a public policy analyst. Her research interests have centered on human development and well-being in Arctic communities at the intersection between the traditional subsistence economy and large-scale resource development. Recent research themes include assessment of risks in Arctic offshore development, the effect of improved institutional design on conflict and ecosystem-based management in the Arctic marine environment, social effects of increasing integration of subsistence economy into the cash economy, and net benefits for local communities of mining or oil and gas development. And she got her doctorate in economics from the University of California, Berkeley. And then finally, Dr. David Yesner, also of the University of Alaska. He's a professor of anthropology at the University of Alaska, Anchorage. And I forget, yep, there you go. His main interests are in environmental archaeology, especially zooarchaeology, ecological anthropology, and hunting and gathering societies. His main areas of interest include the circumpolar region, especially Alaska, the Russian Far East, and southern South America. And he's given a list of some of the projects he's working on, three major ones. The 12,000-year-old Broken Mammoth site near Big Delta, Alaska. The historic Knicktown site near Wasilla, Alaska, which is a little bit more recent. It's a large Gold Rush era community composed of both Euro-American settlers and Dena'ina Athabascans. And then third one is the Boisman II site near Vladivostok in the Russian Far East. He's got master's and PhD degrees in anthropology from the University of Connecticut. So that's our, to my mind, very impressive independent science review panel for this section. And on our list right now is interaction between the science panel and Donna Logan, and Sharman Haley's going to start us off. She's got some prepared remarks.
Thank you, Milo. I'm going to start off today with giving you kind of some conceptual framework for thinking about the baseline document and what the purposes are, and then get more focused on my review and assessment of this. The stated purpose of the environmental baseline document is to characterize the baseline socioeconomic conditions in the study area, and implicit in it and in the remarks by our Pebble hosts this morning is that It will be used for project planning, for the project design. It will be used to identify issues and gaps in the data for the design of further studies. And it will contribute to the baseline data for the NEPA analysis, both in the background description of the affected environment and as a first step towards thinking about designing the research for impact assessment and future monitoring. Now, I want to recall some of the discussion from the Responsible Mining panel that was the first panel in the Keystone Dialogue series back in December of 2010. Two of the speakers on that panel discussed concepts of sustainable development as development that meets the needs of the present generation without compromising future generations, but it also prioritized the needs of the poor, and there's a lot of attention to the rights and obligations towards Indigenous people and Indigenous communities. And then Koumans on that panel spoke about responsible mining and the triple bottom line of environment, economics, and social impacts. And he observed that environmental impacts are usually negative of a mine. The economic impacts on a large scale are usually positive, or they wouldn't be doing it in the first place. But the social impacts can go either way. And the challenge is to assess the social impacts at the local scale, because the local people bear the brunt of the risks and negative impacts, and from a sustainable development framework, there need to be compensatory benefits at the local scale. So in the balance, the social impacts are critical to the viability of the project, and they are very hard to measure and assess, and they are typically not done very well. So it's a developing area of research and methodology. In addition to mitigating the negative impacts on local communities, the project must provide net benefits I already stated that it must provide net benefits at all levels, local, state, national. The outcomes, the social outcomes, depend on social and economic structures, which the baseline document is trying to characterize. It also depends on corporate and governmental policies, which is beyond our immediate scope now of study, and it also very much depends on the responses of the local communities and the capacities of the local communities to engage in the process and claim benefits and proactively participate to identify problems and mitigate problems. Just a few examples of direct benefits and some of the challenges assessing the direct benefits pose. Everyone wants jobs. How do we know that local people are going to get those jobs? I think we heard that at a 46% graduation rate in the Lake and Penn Borough, those youth are not prepared to take jobs in the mining industry if they aren't getting through high school. What are the communities and the school districts and the partnership with Pebble going to do to help prepare local people to get those jobs? The research in other areas shows that the most successful mining projects at local hire had explicit local hire preferences. We can't do that at Pebble because it's unconstitutional here. So people are going to have to think carefully about what policy initiatives they can design into the process to help be successful in securing net benefits on a local level. Purchasing and contracting, is there going to be an entrepreneurial incubator program that will allow local companies to grow and get some of the intermediate benefits? Sure, income is great. Additional income, especially in poor communities, is great. But history in other places shows that there are sometimes some trade-offs, and do we have the research skills to assess and anticipate, and the policy skills to plan for some of those trade-offs? For example, when people's incomes go up, sometimes they lose their subsidized housing benefits, and most of the housing in rural communities, as was pointed out, is in fact public housing. And so because housing is such a large share, and utilities are such a large share of the cost of living, are they any better off or not? We need to think ahead to be able to assess these kinds of social impacts. Some other effects: Alaska Native communities culturally are highly egalitarian, cooperative, sharing-based communities. Sometimes introducing inequalities, some people get the jobs and have high incomes and other people don't, can introduce strains into those communities. What are the impacts of unequally income increases going to have on those communities? Donna spoke about the challenges in mentioned crime data. Crime data is a problem. There isn't adequate crime data in this region. The research I did many years ago in the North Slope Borough showed that crime rates went up, in particular property crimes went up when incomes went up. I hope that that was a short-term effect. I didn't do follow-on research to see how long it persisted. I was able to do that research because the North Slope Borough has an integrated police department that staffs all the communities. So they had a uniform data set that I could do longitudinal and cross-section analysis on. We can't do that in this region, so it's challenging. Infrastructure and services. A new transportation corridor is likely to be used for other purposes besides the mine, and it may lower cost of living for some of for fuel costs for communities in the region, or it may change the economics in the local utilities, the electric utilities and such. We need to prepare to be able to analyze a range of impacts and benefits like this. So a quick preview of my review of the environmental baseline document is that I assume that these consultants were given the charge to do a desktop analysis 2004 through 2008 or 9, and desktop analysis means existing data. I think they actually did a good job given that charge. I think that the data that they assembled shows that they understand Alaska data sources. They understand the limitations of Alaska data sources. They understand the context of Alaska communities that this data represents. But, and I'm sure everyone knows that we need to update it, that ending in 2009 is not an adequate baseline. I think I will also argue that we need more trend data, annual trend data, because one of the challenges is going to be identifying impacts from the mine and teasing them out from effects from other ongoing social and economic processes. And that's a big research challenge, and there needs to be a richer data set in cross-section and in time series, and more thought about what the driving factors are independent of the mine that will help us tease out mine effects from non-mine effects on communities. And also the study, of course, being limited to secondary data, there's a lot of things that we simply haven't been able to measure yet, and I'm going to argue that that primary data collection is going to be needed. All right, I basically talked about the strengths. I'll also note that I thought their history section was very good, and I thought that their discussion of governance showed that they understood why governance is an important dimension, issue. On updating the study, the environmental baseline study relied heavily on census data. Well, you can't update it using census data because they changed the census in 2010, and you can no longer get a rich place level data set with all the variables that were available in 1990 and 2000. The American Community Survey, which is supposed to replace the census long form, does not have adequate sample sizes to represent Alaska rural communities, small communities at a place level. So that's a huge challenge for Alaska researchers, and it's going to take some thoughtful research design and methodology to address this limitation in secondary data. I already explained we need to be able to identify external drivers independent of the mine, and to be able to look at trend data and tease out mine impacts from other impacts that are ongoing. Okay. Expanding on the scope is limited piece. I'm going to call on three major bodies of literature that would inform primary data collection. One is the classic work on socioeconomic impact assessment by Leistritz and Murdoch from 1981. Two is a rich body of work done by Kieran O'Fairclay, who's an Australian who is the world's leading scholar on the impacts of mining on Indigenous people. And he's done lots of work in Australia. He's also done a lot of work in Canada. He has been to Alaska, but doesn't have a rich research record here. And I just cited three of his pieces of work, which will help inform an understanding of what kinds of things to be thinking about as we design primary data collection to assess social impacts. And then the third body of research is something called the Arctic Social Indicators Project. This is an initiative of the Arctic Council. They are now wrapping up phase 2 of their research project, and it's designed to define a standardized set of social indicators that can be collected across jurisdictions and be comparable, and making sure that we hit all those benchmark indicators will help enormously in comparing the study impact area with what's going on in other areas. Kieran O'Fairclay, two of the arguments he makes is that you have to use a theoretical framework of what kinds of effects, social effects, are likely if you're going to be able to predict impacts, forecast impacts, and if you're going to design policy measures to minimize the negative impacts and maximize the benefits. You need to have a theoretical framework. He's done it. Start with his piece. Okay. He also has a whole book on assessing mining social impacts and outcomes, and in that book, he argues that you should be assessing it relative to the objectives at the outset, and also understand that objectives are dynamic, they're not frozen in time, and so that you need to pay attention to that. And so the environmental baseline document did discuss, to some extent, the strategic development planning goals from the local borough and other areas, but that could certainly be developed and analyzed and interpreted more as a framework. I'm running short of time, so I'm going to go light on the classic work that anyone can look at, and they also identify, they give some more definition to what kinds of social effects that they think should be measured, and of course it includes attitudes, values, and perceptions. You have to have primary data for that. The Arctic Social Indicators Project, the Arctic Human Development Report identified 6 domains that are important for human well-being in the Arctic, and they're in the process of developing measures in all 6 of these domains. Material well-being, I would argue that that's what we've been working on for decades, and we've got a leg up on that. Donna acknowledged that health needs some more work. There are some other population migration measures that we can enrich that analysis with. The 3 new ones that need a lot more work are cultural integrity, contact with nature, and fate control. To my reading, the subsistence chapter does the lion's share of the work in the cultural integrity and the contact with nature category, but we need to do some more work on the fate control, how local communities have the capacity to negotiate with the process of development and be at the table and problem solve and claim their fair share of the benefits. So very quickly, my major recommendations have to do with starting with a literature review to understand the drivers and factors in social outcomes impacts that have been identified by other researchers in other areas, and use that as a framework for thinking about designing the next phase of research here. And use other existing bodies of research to identify specific measures that are comparable between our study area and what other people have been looking at, so that we have a richer body of data for analyzing effects. A big missing piece in the baseline document was cost of living. For rural Alaska, since we've never done a household consumption survey, we can't do a classic market basket-based index, cost of living index, but those of us in the business use a lot of other proxy data, and I'm sure McDowell Group knows where some of the proxy data sources are for cost of living. We already discussed health. It needs to be nutrition as well as behavioral, physical, emotional, and social health. Is the state going to be doing a health impact assessment, or how's that going to be covered in this case? I already talked about fate control. It should include some review of the existing planning documents and statements of local community goals. It should include some assessment of what the institutional resources are. And the environmental baseline document takes a giant step towards the institutional resource piece, but we need to think a little bit more rigorously about how to integrate and analyze the information to help us understand, to build a model for projecting impacts. and social capital, which has a lot to do with people's resilience and capacities for resilience and adaptation. Well-being, we need some integrating measures of social outcomes. There are surveys that use life satisfaction indicators. There's different quality of life measures. So I'm going to end there, and what I'm skipping is some more detailed suggestions, which I will be happy to share with Donna or whoever's interested later. And there are some references here in 2 pages of references. Thank you.
Thanks, Sharman. I guess I'd like to ask Donna and the panel members to go ahead and come up to the front, and maybe we can turn that thing off. So the way that we've kind of done this in the past when we've had a kind of presentation by a review panel member is to give the consultant, in this case Donna Logan, a chance to respond to some of the comments. And Sharman, correct me if I'm mischaracterizing, but I'm guessing that the scope of some of your comments is going beyond this particular study, and I guess I'm wanting to get an idea of things that Donna might address. And I tentatively wrote down things like the use of primary data, challenges with the existing data, the scope of the work, some methodological issues, and you pointed to some literature. Is that a fair assessment of things that might be directed toward Donna?
How come you're way down there?
I expect that Donna will agree with me on a lot of these things. So
Yeah.
Just let her take it.
Yeah, a couple things, and just to carry, yes, the answer is yes. I think that everything that you raised, we would agree with as being important as you are moving forward with the next phases of the type of analysis that's needed. For a baseline, it's really important. I'll give an example, and these are some of the things that Sharman raised, was that, for instance, in the Canadian Arctic, some of the mining communities, particularly the Northwest Arctic, the Northwest Territories, have developed social indicator monitoring programs. And they've done this process that's been very very interesting, kind of a review of those social indicators that are out there, be it employment or pregnancy rates or graduation rates and such. And what's interesting about the work that they've done is that they have this criteria of analyzing the indicators for credibility, for updatability, for comparability, and so on. But they've also evaluated whether they have whether the mines in the Northwest Territories could have an effect, be it a direct effect or an indirect effect on these indicators. As a case in point, teen pregnancy. Some people might say, oh, well, teen pregnancy is going to go up in the region or down in the region or whatever, and as an example, you would track that, monitor to see what really is going on, and there would be also some review on whether the mine would have anything to do with teen pregnancy. I'm using that as an example. It's very interesting research. We're aware of the work that's being done in Canada, in Australia, and I think that it's really moving the industry forward on evaluating and thinking through some of these questions. So I agree with what you had to say. I wanted to also mention, though, that we also have concerns about the 2010 U.S. Census data. For those of you who are familiar with it, or who aren't familiar with it, The 2010 census data, which is not in the EPD, it's a different survey than what was asked in 2000 and 1990. So we have lost, as social researchers, the ability to do comparable trend analyses on a series of data that just doesn't exist anymore. It's very frustrating, and it's even more critical when we get to the small communities in Alaska. It's not just an issue facing Southwest Alaska; it's throughout Alaska, and we are familiar with and have looked at some of the census data, and frankly, some of it is very poor, very, very poor, very high. Well, it's just very poor. So we're very concerned about that as well. And then using this other system, of collecting information through the American Community Survey, if you're not familiar with that, they're moving towards using this survey, this big survey, a big long survey that it goes out to randomly selected households in the community, in the state, for instance. It's done throughout the nation. And statistically, because of the randomness and so on and so forth, they can do a lot of work with it. But when it comes down to a community level basis, they may actually literally only survey one household in Pedro Bay, as an example, and from that make all kinds of suggest all kinds of things with regard to that community, with a plus or minus margin of error that in some cases is as much as 70%. So which is a problem.
So Sherman, do you have some additional comments or additional questions for Donna?
Oh, I think I've monopolized the airways enough. I'll pass on to my colleagues.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask one more thing I wanted to mention, and that was cost of living data. That is a very difficult data to get a hold of. It's very expensive research. McDowell Group did conduct in 2009 a geographic differential study, which is looking at those basket of products and how much it costs to buy the same basket of products in the store in New Halen versus the store in Glen Allen, for instance. And unfortunately, it was done for the state. We did a lot of communities, but we didn't. To take that information and apply it to Southwest has some limitations because we didn't survey all the communities or enough communities probably to give it some the level of detail that you might want in the baseline document. So,
well, I will make one follow-up comment. Probably the biggest component in cost of living that is easy to document is fuel costs.
Right,
and that's
the
most
state,
likely to change.
Right, and the state does collect that information, and that is reportable. But they don't do it. Do they do it for all the communities? No, they just do a select few. Yeah, they do for a lot, but not for some. You probably know, Jennifer, but it's not all the communities.
Okay, well, it looks like Don has some questions or prepared comments.
Oh yeah, I'm up next. I'd like to thank Charmin. She covered an awful lot of stuff that I also had a slide presentation, but that I was going to cover, especially with respect to what's called social impact assessment. I worked with F. Larry Leistritz and Bob Murdoch many years ago, and I think this chapter would improve from looking at a number of measures that they suggest to use as baseline to measure change and potential impacts. And this is based on a lot of research they did in Rocky Mountain West and other places where large-scale mining developments had come in, and they documented the outcomes for the community. These outcomes included, complete devastation of local government, increased huge increases in cost of living, inflation, so forth and so on. So I back those comments that Charmin made. My major comment is going to be that Charmin and Donna both talk about access to primary data, and I've asked for many years, but there is a wonderful primary data source on employment, on income, on transfer payments, on wage, with SIC, SOC categories, and so forth for all these communities. And that's part of the ADF&G Harvest Survey. And I don't have the slides, I can't show you now, but they collect data for every person in the household on the jobs that they've had for that year. They collect data on all transfer payment sources. They collect data on all wage employment. And they also collect all the demographic data. More importantly, you can take this data and covary it with other variables that they've collected, such as age, harvest amounts, and so forth. So you can target what one might consider to be vulnerable subpopulations within communities that may be impacted by increases in inflation and so forth, such as elderly, highly dependent upon the subsistence resources with low incomes. That data source is available, and it covers 17 communities, and including 18 with Dillingham, but I don't think those results are out yet. Now, ADF&G collects this information, what's called a flat file access database, and you have to convert it. But what you can end up with, and I've done it for these 17 communities, is you end up with two master files, and that is one master file is at the household level, and it aggregates for that household all their income from all their sources. It aggregates all their harvests by species. It aggregates sharing information. It aggregates at the household level all those variables and attributes that were collected in the multi-page ADF&G Harvest Survey. The second master file is a demographic master file, and this has, whereas the household master file has one record or one row in what one would look at as an Excel file, but one row per household. In the demographic, it's one row per individual within the household, and that individual will include age, ethnicity. Education wasn't asked in the ADF&G Harvest Survey for this 2004-2008. It was an omission, but it'll have participation in subsistence activities and so forth and so on. And this is an absolutely wonderful data source to address many concerns that the communities have about their children's participation in subsistence activities, the relationship between wage income and subsistence harvests. My first suggestion would be that this wonderful data set be incorporated in the chapter. And for example, I'll just give a couple of examples. Since I ran some of the SPSS files and compared with the baseline data from the Pebble, and I'm not going to mention the community, but I found that for example, and one has to realize that based on secondary data, often what happens is they'll take the 2000 census, they'll interpolate what they anticipate happened in 2006, 2008, or whatever, based on some linear models, and they'll use input from Department of Labor and others. But these are all models, whereas the actual ADF&G data is empirical data. So I did some comparisons, and for example, the EBD shows that households below the poverty level was 37%, whereas the empirical research by ADF&G actually indicated it was 47%. And the number of individuals below the poverty level, EBD 45, ADF&G 54%. And it's interesting to note for this community, all but one household below the poverty level are Alaska Natives. This brings up another issue. The ADF&G household data set allows you to ask questions of the data set that secondary literature doesn't. For example, it allows you to disaggregate between long-term Alaska Native households versus more recent non-Native households that may be in the community for employment, such as a school and so forth. And so you avoid what in statistics they call ecological fallacy. That is, where instead of trying to understand just the means or the averages for the community, you're able to disaggregate by ethnicity, by age, by income, by participation in harvesting activities, and so forth. In general, the EBD, in my research, overestimates in constant dollars per capita income by about 20%. The ADF&G data set indicates about 2 out of 3 households are below the poverty line. Indicates that 2 out of 3 of those households that are below the poverty line depend upon 500 pounds or more, or considerably more, of subsistence resources per household. So this is an important baseline attribute or variable to understand that not only are these communities, and I'll be doing subsistence tomorrow, dependent upon subsistence, but those communities that are most dependent upon subsistence resources are actually the least wealthy in the community. In addition, what this points out is that, and this is missing in the EBD baseline data, is what is the replacement cost for these households and these communities should salmon or should subsistence resources not be available? What is it going to cost that household in terms of their cash flow to replace subsistence resources? And I've done some estimates on that, but that's not, I would consider that to be an incredibly important baseline dimension to the EBD report. I won't talk now. I'll present because I have a number of slides that have graphics. But I want to point out that for both this chapter and for the subsistence chapter, the unit of analysis may be incorrect. And by that I mean the EBD reports their information in terms of either individual households or in terms of individuals. But what a ubiquitous research by ADF&G and many other entities indicates for Alaska rural communities is that extended families and multiple households really form the unit of adaptation. That is, one household, perhaps with a younger man, will provide a lot of the subsistence resources. Other households will provide wage to purchase subsistence technology. And I'll have graphics of that tomorrow. But the point that I'm suggesting here is that we're not capturing the important unit for the community in terms of adapting to rapid change that might be brought on by the mine or by other exogenous circumstances. And so that's an important thing to consider. In general, as Donna pointed out, and she said she'd work with Steve Braun and others, but there's very little integration between this chapter and the subsistence chapter. And I'll talk again about that more tomorrow, but cash flow is incredibly important to the ability of these households and communities to continue in subsistence, and that the subtle cause and effect relationship between income and subsistence activities and employment, perhaps at a mine, as indicated perhaps by comparative analysis of something like Red Dog or other places, is that those people that get the jobs often migrate because they have transportation, often migrate to a place like Anchorage or a hub like Kotzebue or Dillingham or whatever. The subtle impact is that they often draw down some of the most productive hunters in the community who are now engaged in wage work. So those are things that have to be balanced out. But to balance them out, you have to have, at the baseline level, that information. I'd also bring up that lacking in the chapter, in my opinion, are any measures of what economists call intrinsic value, and by that I mean subsistence means more to these communities than just nutrition. And what are the value? What is the value, the intrinsic value to the community of a loss of subsistence, not just in replacement cost of the food, but what does it mean to the relationships within the community, the cultural integrity of the community, the long-term viability and sustainability of the community? And so I'll bring that up and talk about it a little bit tomorrow too. But I think it's a major gap, and it's a gap that kind of feeds into one of the things that Sharman brought up, and that's this concept. And there's no independent section, and I think this is the chapter that it needs to be, on environmental justice. And environmental justice essentially asks the question: do small communities, perhaps has already been demonstrated in the demographic analysis, that are predominantly Alaska Native, are they going to bear a larger brunt of the costs of this development than others? And if so, how can that be mitigated? And so I think that's another important dimension that wasn't mentioned in it. And finally, I'll bring up one last topic, and that's it seems really important to me that outsiders not make the decisions about the costs and benefits of a project like the Pebble Mine, that the complex personal calculus about how do I weigh the potential of jobs, how do I weigh the potential of employment for my children in the community against the potential costs of impacts to my my subsistence way of life, to my ability to harvest subsistence products. How do I weigh those costs and benefits? And I think that has to be done by the individuals and the households in the community. And to do that, I think in terms of primary data collection, we need to have some attitudinal questions. The subsistence chapter does have kind of anecdotal responses by elders to their feelings towards Pebble, but that's not systematized so we know what proportion feel that way or other attributes associated with it. So I really think that we need another round of primary research that includes attitudinal questions for households and individuals within the community about their attitudes towards the Pebble Mine. And I think that needs to also be linked with what I call social network analysis, and I'll talk a little bit about that tomorrow too. So I'll leave it at that for the moment.
I have one follow-on comment to Dawn, and I certainly agree with the attitudinal questions in a survey, but I would not frame them as attitudes towards Pebble, because this is supposed to be a pre-mine study, and I would ask attitudes about job trade-offs between jobs and subsistence and the value of getting a broader framework of values to work with.
Okay, Donna, do you want to?
Well, I just wanted to say that we did look at ADF&G's subsistence survey data. In fact, some of it is in the EBD work, so we are aware of it. And we did make a choice to go with the census data over, and so not representing two different sets of socioeconomic data. You would have, for a number of reasons. One, the ADF&G surveys were not done on a consistent year level for all the communities. That is a process that, as you can imagine, going in and doing a census for any of these communities, they may do 5 communities one year and 7 communities another year, and so on and so forth. So, and as anyone knows, subsistence can vary significantly from one year to the next. It's also a point in time with any of these census of capturing, information at a point of time, and so the comparability issue was something that we considered. But we were aware of this, the ADF&G data. We looked at the ADF&G data. In fact, we looked at it in raw form and actually provided some evaluation of the data to Alaska ADF&G, and we decided to not report the data that would be that would present a conflict in data, having two numbers out there for household or population per se, but rather use the ADF&G data in here to supplement information that we couldn't get from the U.S. Census. For instance, we have some employment data on where people traveled for their employment. That's in the EBD. So I just wanted to say your point's well taken, Don, about a very rich data set and the value that it could bring to the discussion, and also that linkage and that integration between the cash economy and the subsistence economy. I agree. But I just wanted to point out that it was not an oversight on our behalf to not include that data. We just chose, because of the comparability data, the comparability aspect of it, to report the census data instead.
Well, can I respond to that real briefly? I've done a lot of work with the census data as a consultant for other boroughs and so forth. And as I think you mentioned as an offhand comment, the standard error for ADF&G survey research is much, much better, and their research is much, much more thorough than the census data. And I go back to the point, not only is it more reliable and more representative and has a closer standard error around the parameter, but the important point is that you can't covary the census data. You know the distribution of income and you know the distribution of harvest, but you can't link them up.
No, I agree. I agree. Yeah. But they're both censuses. So I just want to put that out there. They're both censuses. That's not really, when I mentioned the margin of error, that was referring to the community survey and the margin of error with the community survey as well. So,
okay, Steve, do you have any questions or comments at this time?
Not at this time.
Okay, David?
Well, much of what I had to say has already been dealt with by the previous two respondents, but I'll reinforce both the importance of primary data as part of environmental baseline data, but even more so what Don has been saying about the interaction between subsistence and socioeconomics. We heard a lot of data about income levels, and quite clearly it can be used to differentiate communities, whether you're looking at gross income levels or dividing by population for communities like Iliamna and to some degree Port Allsworth, even Pedro Bay from other communities. But the question is, first of all, how much of that income is fisheries derived, and what does that mean when we link it with the degree of dependency on subsistence resources, particularly fishing resources? How does that relate to a sharing within communities and sharing within kinship networks and so on? And what does that mean in terms of the degree of fallback that individuals, families, households, kinship groups, and whole communities have when one resource is is impacted or another? What does it mean when are differential impacts on commercial fisheries versus subsistence fisheries both simultaneously, or when caribou populations are affected, and so on? What's the nature of the interdependence of these things that allows us to really determine how much resilience there is in the overall system? So I think that when we're looking at these data, we need to look at it at all levels, from the individual, the household, kinship unit, and villages as a whole, in order to really get at some I think improved notion of what level of resilience is possible given the interlinkages between these different variables. So that's my only comment.
Fair enough. Yeah, I agree.
All right. Well, I know Josh Greenberg is one of the primary reviewers of this section of the environmental baseline documents. So, Josh, do you have comments or suggestions or questions?
I have some questions, and again, many of my questions have already been brought out in the prior discussion. One question I had is, the 2000 census is outdated, and so the question is, what is the plan for going forward from this point? So 2000 obviously doesn't characterize current conditions, and then some of the trends that were identified are based on 1990 and 2000, and so that's not really an adequate base for going forward and looking at trends down the road. And so I guess one thing is plans for going ahead and moving forward with that, and so I didn't hear what exactly was going to be done on that. Another thing was that in looking at the reported information, there's lots of different years referenced and different time periods referenced. So some of it is for 2000, some of it goes through 2000, some 2005, 7, 8, 9, 10. And I know the idea is to try to present all these different pieces of information and bring them together in some whole picture of the communities. But when you have all these different end dates in there, it's difficult to be able to reconcile all that data. You want me just to go forward with my questions? So another issue I had is, it's been acknowledged, the problems with the data and the problems that you have in collecting information relevant to rural Alaska. And I know that you mentioned that you had done some interviews with people, and I was just wondering how the validity of the data was checked, and has it been checked, or is it going to be checked, and the reliability of the data. So how reliable is the data? And I didn't see really any sort of methodological assessment of the validity or reliability of the data in the chapter, which I think is important because of all the shortcomings that are mentioned. So whether or not we're getting a picture of what we think we're getting a picture of is really not it was difficult to determine in there. I would reiterate the importance of cost of living information and replacement costs, so that's already been stated. And you already mentioned the problems with going ahead and developing trends and forecast. And one of the things that occurs, and there's not really an analytical framework that's presented here, so it's data description, and that really limits the ability to go ahead and provide outlooks. And so we go through all the information, and then there are outlooks presented, but they're very limited outlooks, and it's really kind of speculative rather than being based on some solid foundation. It was already acknowledged about the difficulty with the subsistence sector, and really it goes beyond that. So really, there's no integration of the subsistence sector and the cash sector, and there is that integration that's there. So the separation into sort of two different chapters, two different discussions, two different sort of frameworks is something that doesn't allow for us to look at how those two sectors of the economy, and they're both, subsistence is an important sector in the regional economy. It doesn't bring that into the socioeconomic discussion. And I have just a couple more comments. So on the Bristol Bay section, one thing is in the description of the Bristol Bay salmon fishery, this is just sort of a small point, you mix reference to the period when the fishery was in a slump and the more recent period when the fishery has been in a period of recovery. So there's a quote in there that the fishery is arguably no longer viable economically. And I don't think that was something that would be a way of characterizing the fishery in the current period. And so just going ahead and checking that and making sure that the description of the fishery references the more recent periods and not the period in the early 2000s when the fishery was in economic dire straits, difficulty. Another comment on the fisheries is that the fisheries is a foundation of the communities, and it's cited over and over again for the communities, that the fisheries are an economic foundation. But the data that's presented is for harvest data, and then the revenue that comes from harvest data, and then some data on the fishery processing. But the fisheries sort of stream out into the communities in a variety of fashions. There's a whole support network of supporting industries that are present in the communities, and then it also comes back to the households in ways that isn't captured simply by looking at returns to the commercial fishermen or returns to the permit prices, or by the employment data from the fish processors. So there's no tie of the fisheries to the broader regional economy. It's sort of just this direct look. And I think that's really something that that should be looked at and examined. I don't know if I should go on. So I have two more comments. Okay. So basically, one of the things is when people hear socioeconomics, and people learned I was looking at socioeconomics, they're kind of thinking of benefit cost analysis. They're thinking about evaluation of economic trade-offs. And so I know that wasn't the scope of work that you were presented, but I thought I would bring that up here. So there's basically, there's not a basis here for economic impact assessment or economic impact assessment down the road. And there's sort of two forms that could take. One would be looking at a regional economic analysis and trying to be able to determine what the impacts would be to employment and jobs if we had some change occur in the regional economy. And that would require developing a regional economic model that looked at the interlinkages that exist between businesses, between communities, between households. And so there's no regional economic model here. And I know you're familiar with multipliers. There's no ability to go ahead and be able to develop multipliers. The other thing is, in terms of cost-benefit analysis, and this was already mentioned, but there's no valuation that occurs of the resource. So we have fisheries, and the value of the resources as represented here would be through harvest revenue and jobs in the processing sector. But there's all sorts of benefits to people, and people have value for the fishery that extends well beyond that. And you could go ahead and you could look at other resources as well. So there's all sorts of values that aren't captured in here. So it doesn't provide the basis for cost-benefit analysis. So really, this document really isn't, or the scope of this doesn't provide a basis for conducting economic impact assessment. Those are my comments.
Well, they're great comments. All of them are great. I don't know. Which one should I start with? First of all, the one that's most concerning to me was the quote that you mentioned about the fisheries, and so I want to definitely go back and take a look at that. But having said that, there are sections of this report that's explained up front that, for instance, the history section that we got compliments on, we actually didn't prepare that section. That was done by Steve Bronze, and same with the history of the commercial fishery. And I don't know if that's where that went in, but I think
it's in both.
Yeah.
And it references, part of it references the period in the early 2000 period when there was a slump.
Yeah.
And then part of it references the period since recovery. And I think there might even be data tables which focus on the period when the fishery was in a downturn. And then later ones which go ahead and look at more recent conditions. So it sort of goes back and forth.
So yeah, because there's that history in the front, and then there's the more current data that you see through later in the document.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and the more current data later in the document was produced by us. So I definitely want to go back and take a look at that. So that was the comment that actually provided me the most concern of what you said. It's interesting when you do a baseline, I think a point's well taken. A lot of people assume that a baseline is the same thing as doing a cost-benefit analysis or doing an economic impact analysis. And often what people really think they want is an economic impact analysis, where they just don't want to hear just kind of, here's the data out there describing a community, but rather let's talk about the recreation industry and what kind of impact that has on the economy in the area, and or let's look at the commercial fishing and understand better the economic impacts on the area. And so that additional analysis in those areas, I think, would strengthen our knowledge and understanding of the socioeconomic region in general. So I agree. I agree with that. But again, as a baseline document, when you start getting into impact analyses or potential impact analyses, then as Sharman was saying, you don't want to bias it. You want to keep it baseline. So we want to keep that in mind. There is no forecasting, again, because it's baseline. So the regional outlook in a baseline document, while that may be useful and for other types of things, typically you don't see that kind of forecasting going on in a baseline document. So that's really one of the main reasons why you don't see it or enough of it. There is no valuation analysis. It's an evolving field. There are a lot of concerns and questions regarding the methodology on that, and again, it was just not something that was in our scope for consideration. So anyway,
Could I just make one?
Yeah.
One brief comment on the last thing, because I didn't come on that before, but I think at both the end of Don's and Josh's contributions, they did mention this valuation, and certainly something I'll talk about tomorrow in terms of the cultural resources, that is values of the land, values in the landscape that are really hard to integrate into a cost-benefit analysis in any easy way, but clearly people have, through the network of social relations, certain kinds of values on the land. You may term them spiritual values. You may term them a variety of things, places where people did things in the past that are part of what some call landscapes of memory and association and so on, that are very hard to integrate into traditional cost-benefit analyses, but doesn't mean they're any nonetheless real for people. And if there are ways of integrating some of those kinds of things as a part of baseline studies, then so much the better in terms of the value, I think, of such studies to all the different stakeholders involved.
One of the things I did want to respond to, and I forgot, was the use of executive interviews to verify information. It was used largely to verify the community infrastructure and the health infrastructure and utilities and so on and so forth, because that information is, it's not necessarily, I don't want to say data-driven, but it's, you can read a description of a community, but you want to make sure and verify, is that place still open and operating, and so on and so forth. So that's the level of verification that we did. We did not do any kind of executive interviews with regard to, like, household income, for instance, that kind of thing.
Do you have any plans? Do you have any plans to do that? To go in and assess the quality, given the problems?
Do we have plans? I think that I suspect that there will be more efforts there. I don't have anything to say directly. I think you do raise a really important question with regard to where do we go as far as updating the EBD in light of the census data. And even the fish and game data. I don't know when they plan to go back and update their subsistence survey in these communities as well. But do you know, Don, when they're going to update that?
Well, I think when the PLP pays them.
Right. Okay. Okay.
So Sherman has been patiently waiting to make a comment here.
The comment I was going to make was following up on Dawn and the value of subsistence being a lot more than nutrition. It has to do with the reproduction of cultural values and the fabric of community life. It has to do with sharing networks, and in some cultures it has a lot to do with legitimate leadership, legitimacy of leaders, and so if anything that has an effect on subsistence relationships is going to have ripple effects on a lot of the social capital and social fabric in the community. And there need to be ways of assessing that, understanding that.
And can I make a couple quick comments? in my talk tomorrow on subsistence, I'll go over how ADF&G has used social network analysis to try and quantify that. And so I'll talk about that tomorrow. I want to make a couple of quick other comments. One was on the infrastructure descriptions in the chapter. The social impact assessment literature shows that when you bring a lot of people into small communities, there's lots of problems. Demand for services, such as schools or water or electricity or housing, increased demand for those services. There's real concerns for the existing political organizations of the community as they're overwhelmed by demands. There are huge increases in social pathologies, such as increases in alcoholism. Exxon Valdez showed us this for sure, and drug use and suicide and so forth. And I know you talked about how difficult it was to access a lot of this health and other data, but I think the descriptions of the infrastructure can be expanded. I mean, there are hints of it in some of the communities. For example, there's a mention that there was problems with the sewage system in one of the communities and so forth and so on. But what I'm really talking about is some effective description of the existing capacity. Mm-hmm. Because what happens is if you double the population of the region in 3 years, you're going to have increased demands. And it's my guess that existing infrastructure is in no position to meet that demand. And it'd be really nice to know for a variety of services, from electricity, water, sewage, et cetera, school and education, just what the existing capacities are. And so that would be one expansion. And the second thing is we've talked a lot about its baseline description and so forth and so on. But inherent in a lot of the chapter were conclusions about the economic viability of various sectors within the region. And the chapter talks about comfish, government, and tourism being the major economic sectors. And then it goes through each one of those and describes sustainability and viability of those sectors. And then the chapter does come to the conclusion on page 231 of chapter 21, only Pebble offers substantial opportunity for economic development. So that is a conclusion, and I think what we need to do in the chapter is to really visit the other economic sectors. And for the most part, I really agree. You point out the visitor industry is an important part of the regional economy, but is driven by non-local ownership and employment. Government is by far the largest source of year-round employment, although we don't have specific data about half the employment in the local government sector and so forth and so on. So I think we really need to explore the sustainability of these other sections before we can make a comment about the economic opportunity just from one sector alone.
I'm looking at page 231, and the quote I think that you're referring to is incomplete. While mineral exploration activity is continuing, the mining industry does not appear to offer any substantial economic development opportunity for the region in the foreseeable future other than that related to the Pebble project, which is different than what I think I heard you say. But your point still will take in drawing conclusions, and that's the dangerous part of when you prepare a regional outlook component of a baseline, that you are making some assumptions about where things are heading or where things could head. So that needs to be read with that caveat in mind. So I just, on one hand, I hear we need more regional outlook, but then the other hand is you have to make some assumptions and determinations when you do that, and so you can get in trouble. So
yeah, and maybe I didn't frame my response. I really don't have any problem with making conclusions. I think we all do. I was
Well, I
mainly
don't think
using
we don't want to make those kind of value judgments on the baseline. So I want to be careful about that, those kind of conclusions.
Yeah, well, and I guess I was kind of going the other way.
Yeah.
If we're going to make value judgments, let's make them on all sectors. And I think we make value judgments anyway,
Yeah.
period, even in descriptions.
Following up on that, tourism is an area where we need a lot better data and information to fairly assess its contributions to local communities. The data just doesn't exist very much, and I've asked my colleague Steve Colt to address this in his remarks tomorrow because he's ICER's point person on understanding and measuring tourism.
So let me just throw out a couple of lessons just on, I think, what the earlier science review panel came up with just in terms of organizing comments. One of the things that they eventually settled on, I think, was identifying comments that were pertinent to the adequacy of the studies for characterizing the baseline versus comments that were more directed at assessing impacts. And so I think that's helpful for the Pebble people in particular, if you could do that. The other thing that came up, I think, is that at the conclusion of the last panel, there was a lot of discussion about parts of the baseline documents that they thought were done well, but that hadn't come up earlier because it's pretty easy in the review panel to zero in on those areas where you see some deficiencies. So I just wanted to throw that out there for you guys to consider.
Just a quick response to that. I thought Sharman outlined in her presentation what she thought were the positives. That's why.
Yes, Sherman did. Definitely, I agree with that.
So I didn't reiterate